Hi, welcome to this lecture on second wave feminism, which is also known as Women's Lib, the women's liberation movement. This movement started around the early 1960s and ended in the early 1980s, probably more like 1980. So after a group's progress, after there's a big push and some achievements, there's often a contrary movement to try and undermine or reverse that progress. This is known as a backlash. After the first wave feminism accomplished its goal, which was the right to vote, women's suffrage, and after the early 1940s, which got women out into the workforce, into the public sphere, because the men were off fighting in World War II, and obviously we needed the labor. After that, there was a political, social, and religious conservative movement to try and get women back into the home, which is called the private sphere, in the 1950s. I think we're all familiar with 1950s images of, quote unquote, the perfect family with a stay-at-home mom, a working dad, 2 children, the picket white fence, right? So all these images that we think of when we think of the 1950s, this was all a media push to get women to stop working and to return to the home because the war ended and there was this fear that women would be taking up jobs from the people who really needed it, and that's obviously the men returning from the war. So that was the backlash. There were all these media campaigns that really set the tone for whatever the country needed. So whereas we think of Rosie the Riveter, like women can do it, right? That was a push to get women out into the labor force. And once women started making their own money and felt self-sufficient and realized they could run their families, this would not bode well once the men returned from the war. So there was this big movement then with counter media images to try and make women feel like their rightful place was in the home, letting men, be the breadwinners. So this is also a common argument, saying that, you shouldn't be taking jobs from those who really need it. It's also a common argument used to keep minorities from equal access. So, for example, we hear this kind of train of thought when a woman goes into a traditionally male field, like a STEM field, or with affirmative action, right? We would hear that these positions that are quote unquote reserved for women and people of color, they're this quota system. It's really taking jobs away from more qualified candidates. And the implication when you hear such an argument is that the more qualified candidates are white males, that white males are being displaced by minorities and women. Every generation of feminists has had to fight to change or maintain the progress that's important to them. In second wave feminism, they picked up the fight for all the things that first wave feminists put on the back burner while they focused on suffrage. Now, it's important to note that not all feminists were 100% behind suffragism on its own. So they had all kinds of ideas that they wanted to fight for, right? Education and the right to work, the right to have fair divorce and childcare laws. So all of these things, they never really went away. There were always women who were focused on fighting for this. So this really surfaced in the early 1960s. So some of the goals and accomplishments of second wave feminists are the following: equal access to higher education. The civil rights movement accomplished this for women. So when we think of civil rights, we think of Dr. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, we think of African Americans, right? And again, just like during the suffrage movement that had um, a lot of support by the abolitionists, even though history doesn't really tell us about Black men and women's role, important role in progress in this country. The civil rights movement that started with Martin Luther King, um, really the biggest beneficiaries of equal access to higher education was middle class white women. They benefited the most from this movement. Racism was still a big issue, but when open access to higher education was won, it was women, white women in particular, who really came onto the scene in higher education and enrolled in universities. Employment, that was a big gain. There was opportunity, equal pay for equal work, sexual harassment awareness. These were big discussions that women's lib made, household discussions. So there were certain laws that were enacted. In politics, the goal was to get female representation at all levels and enact laws that would ensure their equality. Women said we need representation at all levels, from city hall, school boards, all the way up to Washington, to Congress. So, for example, they tried to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. The Equal Rights Amendment would guarantee that no right could be revoked on the basis of sex. It's called the ERA. They tried to pass this amendment for 2 decades. For about 20 years or more, they worked on trying to have this amendment added to our Constitution, that no matter what, no right would be revoked on the basis of sex. Sadly, in the 1980s, which was a very conservative decade during the Reagan administration, it did not pass. It fell short by 4 states' approval. So if 4 states had voted for it, it would have passed. So most people are very shocked to learn that even to this day, there's nothing in our Constitution that protects our rights on the basis of sex. I guess the way around it is that once there's an amendment to the Constitution, it applies, it's seen as applying to all citizens, right? But I think women who know that there is a backlash would feel safer knowing that there is an explicit protection in our Constitution saying that we will not revoke a particular right based on sex. Another goal and accomplishment was the sexual revolution. This was big in the 1960s and 70s. I'm sure you've all heard, make love, not war. So with the sexual revolution came women having a choice. And that's all it means. And conservatives really use this to say that the sexual revolution was, ruining our culture, that it was breaking the tradition, that women were becoming sluts, all this thing, right? All this stuff, right? But really, the sexual revolution, the key word is choice. That women have a choice whether or not to have sex. That women have a choice with whom to have sex. That women have a choice whether or not to have children. That they should have a choice whether or not to get married. So it was all about choice. That's the key word to remember in the women's lib movement. That a woman could be the decider of her own life, her daily actions, short-term and long-term, instead of following the script written by society for women. That there was, everything was prescribed. That she would go to school, get married, have kids, and that would be basically an accomplished woman's life. So no, women decided no, it will be my choice, not society's choice, what I do when and with whom. Just like men get to choose when they marry, what career they want, who they sleep with. So women wanted to freely enjoy their sexuality, and all of that calls for shattering the double standard that only men can and should enjoy sex. Um, but along with that, for women, women who are fertile, um, you can't really freely, carelessly enjoy sex without thinking about consequences. So contraceptives were a big part of the discussion, right? And that's when the pharmaceutical industry was started exploring the pill and other methods. Um, Women also said, if we're going to enjoy our sexuality, then we need to have the right to choose whether or not I want to have a child. So Roe v. Wade was part of second wave feminism. In 1974, this made the Roe v. Wade case made abortion legal, again giving the woman the choice to have a child, that it was her decision and no one else's, not the government, not the doctor, not her parents or her partner, would have the choice. Only she would. It's important to know that before the 1970s, even married women could not have the birth control pill from their doctors unless their husband agreed to it. So a wife, an adult woman, needed the permission of her husband to be on birth control. And this is tough. I know that today some people argue that whether or not a male should have a say in the right of abortion if his female partner gets pregnant. The thing to remember is that historically, men could leave or could deny being the child's father. And this used to leave the woman as the caretaker for the rest of her life. It changed her life forever. She would have to be responsible financially, emotionally for this child. So if we look at history, it's only up until very recently in history that we've had paternity tests, DNA, right? And laws for child support. But for the vast majority of history, if a woman got pregnant, it was, her responsibility and nobody else's. So women looking at this thought, oh, well, I should be able to decide whether I want to alter my life forever, because there's no guarantee that I will have a co-partner. So the right to contraceptives, to abortion, the rise of Planned Parenthood clinics, all of this providing confidential reproductive health care to women, regardless of their income, regardless of insurance or marriage status. All of this was born out of second wave feminism. All of this just came about in the 1960s to 1980s. Other major goals and accomplishments were that women's liberation movements started talking about domestic violence in a way that had never been talked about before. The second wave established domestic violence emergency shelters, hotlines where women can call and just get some support online if they were being abused at home. There were laws enacted to protect women from abusive partners. I like to talk about the rule of thumb, no more. In the early 1900s, the phrase the rule of thumb meant that a man could legally beat his wife as long as the belt or rod was no wider than the length of his thumb. So take a moment to let that sink in. It used to be legally acceptable for men to beat their wives. So whenever you hear someone today use a phrase, oh, a good rule of thumb is to blah, 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 it's important to know where this history came from.